George and Gordon Gund, the owners of the Minnesota North Stars, were looking to relocate their failing franchise to the Bay Area. The NHL declined, as it is wont to do, but granted them the ability to purchase an expansion team in the Bay Area. And they did, for $50 million. I don't have $50 million lying around, so I have no idea if this is a good idea or a bad idea. I don't even know if it's an idea. The North Stars would be left in the dust and eventually relocate to Dallas under new ownership, but whatever. The Guns team would become the San Jose Sharks, riding high the tidal wave of teal that dominated 90s sports teams. Populating the roster was a weird process, a far cry from what we've seen in recent expansion drafts. Technically, the first part was a dispersal draft, where the Sharks selected 14 North Stars skaters and 2 goalies, after the Stars protected 14 skaters and 2 goalies. So, the Sharks could only really pull 4 active NHL players from the North Stars roster. And then the expansion draft began in earnest. With both the North Stars and the Sharks sitting below the minimum amount of roster players, the other 20 teams had to cough up a player for them. They could protect 2 goaltenders and 16 skaters. So pickings for the Sharks were even worse in this case. So the Stars had a motley crew roster, which was tinkered with a tad before the start of the 1992 season. Pat Falloon was the Sharks' first ever draft pick, and he led the team in points in their awful first season. He has the unfortunate distinction of having a pretty decent career sandwiched between 2 bona fide superstars, which isn't very flattering. But don't worry, literally every other Sharks first-round pick after him would be a home run. Nobody expected them to be good then, though. And they weren't. They only won 17 games and were worst in the league by 12 points. But hey, teal jerseys. The Sharks played in an arena originally called the Cow Palace, which was an arena built before Pearl Harbor. That is asking to be a losing franchise. The North Stars made the playoffs that year too, so oh well. At least they secured a great draft pick, 3rd overall. That was one Mike Rathje. He didn't play that year. And some say the Sharks didn't either, because they set a league season record 71 losses, and the record for most consecutive losses, 17. But somehow they weren't the worst team. The Ottawa Senators had 24 points as well, but only 10 wins to the Sharks' 11. This is nearing Washington Capitals levels of expansion suckitude. Expansion teams are expected to struggle, but this is really scraping rock bottom. It's almost cruel. The San Jose Sharks needed something big to happen to maintain any semblance of compete in their 3rd season. Enter Kevin Constantine. For 2 years, Constantine had been the coach of the Sharks' IHL affiliate, the Kansas City Blades, and having coached many of the young players in San Jose's system, he was familiar with them as they made the jump to the big leagues. But he wasn't just any replacement coach for a poverty franchise. He was ahead of the curve. Nowadays we hear about advanced stats all the time, but before expected goals or Corsi or any of that, there was Kevin Constantine asking a staff member to chart the teams and their opponent's shot attempts on a map of the rink, alongside blocks or anything else. It gave him the ability to look beyond simple stats and look at the quality of the play itself, either for or against. Remember, this was in the early 90s. That kind of analysis pretty easily predates its mainstream exposure. He used this analysis to form a defensive-minded system which the team desperately needed, having given up 414 goals the prior season, a league worst. The idea was to play well enough to win in the 50% of the time you don't have the puck, and the rest might take care of itself. Of the 34 players that were there from day one of the San Jose Sharks team, only 6 would suit up for them in the 93-94 season, just 2 short years later. The familiar faces Constantine would coach included 2 1991 second-rounders in offensive defenseman Sandis Ozolinsh and elusive playmaker Ray Whitney. In the prior season, each of them played about a third of the season, splitting duties between Cali and KC, but they were in the Bigs full-time now. Neither was going to be a game breaker, but they were solid, and they were only going to get better. The Sharks were really, really good at drafting, man. Also coming out of the wings for a full-time role was a young, right-handed, undersized offensive defenseman named Tom Peterson. Very much in the mold of a 2020s NHL defenseman, Peterson's stature and style of play, for better or worse, were ahead of his time, but he and his would have a big impact on the Sharks' fortunes. The other Constantine disciple was Arturs Irbe, a diminutive Latvian goalie who could really move. With the offseason trade of Jeff Hackett and losing goalie Brian Hayward in free agency, the Teal Terrors would lean on Archie, who had only played partially in 2 seasons and whose numbers weren't that good. Yet. Irbe holds the distinction of being the only goaltender known of who sewed his own pads. He would patch up his own pillows, which over time had become so marked with pucks that they were more gray than white. In that offseason, another expansion draft would take 2 skater-sized bites out of the existing teams. Some teams calculated that there were obvious players to lose, and thus decided to trade them beforehand to avoid losing them for nothing. One such team was the New York Islanders, and the player in question was Jeff Norton, a playmaking defenseman. He and Ozolinsh would form the dynamic top pair for the Sharks for the majority of the season. But while all of these players had great influence over the '94 Sharks season and how it would go, there were 2 that would surpass even them. On the day of the 1993 NHL entry draft, due to their truly abysmal 92-93 season, the Sharks held the 2nd overall pick. But another team not too far below them on the inverse totem pole had an eye for the kids slated to go 2nd. It was the Hartford Whalers. The Sharks looked at Hartford's roster and thought, there's a guy we could use. So they scratched each other's backs. The Sharks gave up the 2nd overall pick, which would later become legendary defenseman and bastard Chris Pronger, in exchange for the 6th overall pick, the 45th overall pick, the 58th overall pick, and the real diamond of the haul, Sergei Makarov. With an extremely methodical and purposeful style of play, Makarov was one of the pioneers of the Russian puck possession style that came into the NHL in the late 90s. He also holds the distinction of being the oldest player to ever win the Calder Trophy at age 31. He was 35 when this season ended, and he has only played 4 years in the league. Gary Roberts once described him as being built like a fire hydrant. In a goofy waiver claim that indirectly came about because of the Soviet sports bureaus meddling with players' salaries, the Sharks jumped on the opportunity to claim perhaps Makarov's most famous linemate, the professor himself, Igor Larionov. Equally calculating in his puck possession game, there have been few more complete players. On the KLM line with Vladimir Krutov in the Soviet Union, these 2 ate up the competition. And now they were reunited on a Sharks team that was completely reloaded and revamped to turn around their franchise's fortunes. With free agent signees Jamie Baker from the Senators and newly minted captain Bob Airey from the Sabres, it was all systems go. Which is unfortunate because nearly a month into the season, they hadn't won a single game. Right from the get-go, the Sharks had some good news and bad news regarding injury. Pat Falloon's shoulder had cut his season in half the prior year, and Sandis Ozolinsh had his season cut short by a knee injury. But both of them, while not 100%, were nearly ready coming into 93-94. As high-end prospects, I'm sure there were plenty of prayers that their health would hold. The same could not be said for Igor Larionov, who had a separated shoulder and was expected to miss the first 2 games. He would miss a lot more than that. Johan Garpenlov and Bob Airey would also be dinged up to start the season, so... Despite the team's seismic facelift in personnel, the wider world did not afford them any faith. And why would they? The Sharks were not expected to stand out at all in their Pacific Division, even with the addition of 1 or 2 elite players. And the Pacific Division itself was pretty meh. Last place was thought to be up for grabs between them and the newly arrived Ducks. The only people that believed in the Sharks were the Sharks. In their first 2 games of the season, a back-to-back against the 2 Albertan teams, they got squelched by a combined score of 9-4, and they never led once. Against the arch-rival Kings 3 days later, they played well, but got strombolied, and never led. For their first home game of the season, they'd square off against the undefeated Flames looking for their first win. They lost. They were outshot 33-13. Irbe was the sole reason the franchise's first game actually in San Jose wasn't a complete gruel fest. But there was a glimmer of hope. Igor Larionov was expected to take the ice again against the Bruins on Saturday in their next game, and Garpenlov and Airey were on the mend as well. And despite being drastically outplayed, the Sharks were 40 seconds away from winning 1-0. But the Bruins evened the game, and it ended in a tie, with Irbe once again keeping the Sharks buoyant, lifting an offense that had only scored 8 goals in 5 games. His best save of the night came in overtime on a clean break against Adam Oates. Fun fact, Oates' breakaway was made possible by a turnover from Mike Sullivan. Yep, That Mike Sullivan. To make matters worse, Larionov would re-aggravate his injury in the first period. Awesome. Disappointing result aside, at least it wasn't a loss. They still got a point. Maybe this was a sign they were turning it around. Nope. In front of their home crowd and in a neutral site game against the Blues, the Sharks continued on winless. After going 0-8 and 1 in 9 games, the team was looking really dismal, particularly on offense. Their leading point scorer, Makarov, had no goals. The momentum of moving out of the Cow Palace and into the Shark Tank had no effect. The Sharks were the only winless team in the NHL. As the saying went, the Sharks always played just well enough to lose. And just like that, their fortunes turned. It was a day like most others. The Sharks hosted Edmonton for a 6:30 puck drop with Coach Constantine juggling the power play units, the D pairs, anything to try and get something going with Larionov out and Ozolinsh still on the mend. It was a young Oilers team that was 2-7-1, having fully committed to the youth and rebuild after missing the playoffs for the first time since entering the NHL. Todd Ellick wasn't one of them. At 27, he was in his prime, but he had only played 4 games for the Oilers and recorded no points. That night, on October 26th, he played for the Sharks. Yeah, you heard that right. The day of the game, San Jose claimed him off waivers from the Oilers. It's never easy to switch teams, but while Ellick wasn't going far, he felt that being put on waivers was unfair. But apparently it was more of an issue that he wasn't living up to contract. Looking at his stats, that doesn't seem fair either, but who knows? Maybe he just got shafted. In any case, he joined the Sharks bench that night with a mind for revenge. And so would Igor Larionov, who made a surprise return a game or two early. And everything clicked. Larionov scored, Ellick had an assist, and Irbe nearly had a shutout were not for another Sullivan giveaway, and the Sharks freaking won. They trounced the Oilers in shots 32-16 and won 3-1. It took 10 games and a long way back from key injuries and a timely waiver pickup, but they won. And so it begins. The Sharks came out flying against the figuratively fledgling Ducks, and multi-point efforts from Makarov, Larionov, Ozolinsh, and Whitney propelled them to a 4-3 win. The chemistry was there, as if there was ever any doubt. The franchise's first 3-game winning streak would have to wait as they gifted the Capitals a 4-2 win despite playing well. Then, a Tom Peterson OT winner against the hapless Ducks sent the Sharks to a Tuesday night matchup against the Penguins and the returning Mario Lemieux. The Sharks rallied from 2-0 down to tie it. Not a win, but they won a lot of respect that night. A week or so later, they also slugged it out with the 12-1-2 Maple Leafs, tying them and again going blow for blow with a juggernaut. They were about 23 seconds away from winning it too, when Dave Ellett tied the game. These 3 games started them on the long and winding road to improvement. A tough loss to Dallas to keep them humble sent them on a brutal 6-game road trip across the continent to face New Jersey, New York, Washington, Boston, Hartford, and Buffalo. They'd only won 1 game on the road that season, and most of those opponents were pretty darn good. All but the Whalers were legitimate playoff teams. It was a tall order for a team on a short leash, but Coach Constantine had a little more to worry about than the upcoming schedule. In the locker room, there was a little drama. Now, Constantine had stressed a defensive posturing in his system as mentioned, but for one skater core, that wasn't enough. Larionov, Makarov, Garpenlov, Ozolinsh, and Norton were completely content to do their own thing, no matter who they played with. So, after exhausting all other options, Constantine would always assert that he tried the only measure that was left. Just stick them all together. Isolate the problem and force it to flounder, or let the fledgling out of the coop. Makarov famously kept telling Constantine, "Best defense, offense yours." Meaning that when Makarov, Larionov, and their linemate Garpenlov got to playing the methodical possession game they knew had worked for them for decades, the ice would tilt in their favor. They were also less likely to listen to Constantine, as he was only 1 year older and a first-year NHL coach, whereas Makarov and Larionov had been part of the most successful line in the world, the KLM line. Constantine allegedly told his assistant coach that they were his problem now. He'd let the 5 follow their own game plan without interference, as long as they didn't go minus. Let's see how that held up over this brutal road trip out east. In their first game, they chased Brodeur, as that possession line nabbed 5 combined points. They stopped the 8-0-2 in their last 10 Rangers, skating to a 3-3 tie. That top line and D pair again got 7 points between them. The similarly surging Capitals lost as well thanks to a low-event game that benefited the Sharks, and add another 4 points for that top 5. They lost that Thursday to the nude Bruins. Can't win them all. It was still a close game. The Whalers were awful, and the Sharks only loosed 13 shots on them. But they won, I guess. 3 combined points for those rapscallions again. And finally, the next day, they almost led a heroic comeback down 3 against the Sabres, but couldn't quite pull it off as Sandis Ozolinsh hit the post in the final seconds. The top 5 had 6 points. They finished that road trip 3-2-1, which for them, and against the quality of teams they faced, was a resounding success. They rewarded the home crowd after their absence with a late game-breaking goal from Rob Gaudreau to give the Sharks their first ever victory over Detroit. And going undefeated in their next 4 proved that their improvements weren't a recent fluke. This looked like it could be genuine success, and against quality opposition. Had they been an East Coast team, the league may have been put on notice. Since going 0-8-1, they didn't have to just rely on Irbe to shut down the opponent for them. Spearheaded by the likes of Larionov and Makarov, their offense got rolling. The Russians led the way in terms of offense, of course, but that waiver wire pickup Todd Ellick was right there with them making plays, notching 13 assists in that time frame. Maybe best defense offense yours after all. They weren't at the top of the conference or even the division, but they had only lost 2 more games than they won. But no team and no fan tastes victory and thinks, heck, that's enough for me, Reba. Everyone wants it again. So they have to sustain it. They can't be satisfied with just remaining in the middle. The absolute last thing the Sharks can do is go winless. I sure hope that's not what... Against the lowly second-year Lightning, an early 3-goal deficit downed the Sharks, who ironically were quoted as talking about fortunes in hockey and that everything can turn around on a dime. The Red Wings exacted revenge on them at the Joe, a game where Pat Falloon, the team's leading goal scorer, was scratched because Constantine didn't like his play, and where Jeff Norton would sprain his ankle and not play until the new year, and Ozolinsh would suffer a wounded knee to boot. Despite the Hawks only getting off 16 shots, they won. Larionov suffered a strained knee after being taken into the boards by Dirk Graham and would be out again. The lines got thrown into a blender in order to get something going without the professor. Poor Dale Craigwell was promoted to the first-line center between Garpenlov and Makarov. For context, his NHL career was 98 games, and he scored 11 goals. Rob Gaudreau was also lifted up the lineup, specifically to create more offense. Next up against the Blues, the Sharks outshot them 38-18, but lost 3-1, and so on and so on. For most games, there was a theme of controlling play but doing nothing with it until the opponent got it, and Irbe couldn't stop a beach ball. It's cruel. It's the hyperdimensional bungee of luck and circumstance. And what's worse, it didn't seem like the hockey world even noticed. If you didn't follow them, you probably heard about them gaining steam, and then they just fell out of sight and out of mind. I couldn't even find an article from San Jose about this unfortunate run, and what a run it was. They had nearly gone 500, but this brutal December saw them drop all the way to 11-20-7. Then, finally, on the final day of 1993, Yaroslav Odovzhel scored 2 of his 3 career goals, and Todd Ellick broke the tie in the third to win it. And then they went winless in their next 4, so any residual momentum from that win got freight-trained. They blew leads in the first 2, and while Jeff Norton returned to the lineup after missing 9 games in that latter one, he re-aggravated the injury and was out again. Next, the Sharks had the misfortune of having to face a Scotty Bowman-coached Wings team who'd just blown a 4-goal lead in their prior game. I think that speaks for itself. And after almost a week of rest, they could only manage 10 shots against the Kings, giving up 39. The Sharks were back to leaning on Irbe. And quite frankly, Irbe wasn't someone that you could really lean on when your team was San Jose quality. He wasn't bad. An .898 save percentage and about 2.5 goals saved above average. Perfectly fine. But only on the whole. On any given night, it seemed like he could be Patrick Waugh or Patrick... Nah. Got him. Please don't click away. The offense was obviously a little too reliant on a select few people. Since that losing streak started, the Sharks' top 5 had only tallied 10 times in 14 games. Here's a really stark statistic. With the ailing Larionov in the lineup, the Sharks were 11-7-5. Without him, they were 1-14-5. But just before the Kings game, he'd come back into the lineup, though not fully 100%, which is very odd because that seemed to be how he re-aggravated the shoulder injury at the beginning of the season, and what has kept Jeff Norton sidelined since September. With him returning, the likes of Mike Rathje and veteran bruiser Sean Cronin would be slotting in as well, having not earned a consistent spot in the lineup per Constantine's estimation. And it appeared to pay off, thank goodness, because in the final week of the All-Star break, the Sharks were rocking and rolling. A midweek rivalry matchup at Arrowhead saw the Sharks' top line decimate Guy Hebert. A full team effort up and down the lineup was enough to absolutely bury Hartford, and in the first game featuring 2 goalies from the Soviet Union, Irbe was sparkling in a 3-2 win against the Flames. That's a little funny because in the next couple days, Irbe and Ozolinsh would suit up alongside Calgary Flames Al MacInnis and Joe Nieuwendyk for the '94 All-Star Game. Fun fact, when Sandis Ozolinsh made the All-Star festivities as a member of the Avalanche, he once dominated the fastest skater competition so absolutely that he skated the last leg of the lap backwards. This is his planet, really. Anywho, Jason Moore and Jeff Norton finally came back into the lineup alongside Ozolinsh in the first game afterwards. So naturally, Ozo scored 2 minutes into the game. But they lost 8-3. This did not please him. So he kept scoring, going on about a point per game in the ensuing 6-game road trip. They went back and forth with Florida to tie, beat the Lightning in front of 26,000 fans, and nearly came back from a 4-1 deficit against the Isles, and lastly got their second post-regulation win of the season, courtesy of Sergei Makarov. Now sitting at 17 wins, they had a chance to pass their season total from last year with 31 games to spare, but they blew a 3-1 lead to the Blues. A few days later, they ended the road trip and broke the record in style, introducing the Dallas Stars to pain. In that game, Rob Gaudreau and Dale Craigwell, remember them, led the way, with the former netting a hat trick and Craigwell being a fight short of a Gordy. Now with another grueling road trip in the bag, and with a fully healthy lineup, with the All-Star break in the rear view, and breaking the franchise wins record with plenty of runway, the Sharks felt like they were right back in the thick of it for a playoff push. On the docket for the Sharks was a triple helping of potential revenge. A 3-game series against the Blackhawks featuring former Shark Jeff Hackett and future Shark Ed Belfour, who had won the Vezina the prior year and once previous in 1991. The Hawks weren't contenders, but they were much better than the Sharks, so it was going to be a tough out for sure. But a flurry of quick goals on Hackett in the second from Baker and Ozolinsh gave the Sharks a lead that the Hawks almost, but didn't come back from. The second game got nasty quick. The first period consisted of 4 fighting majors, 8 roughing minors, 2 elbowing minors, a tripping, a slashing, and a cross-checking. Almost an hour of PIMs. Hilariously, there were no power play goals in that period, but there were 4 in the second. The first line put on a show again as the Sharks took it 4-3. And in the final installment on Saturday night, Belfour and Irbe had been perfect. No goals in the first, no goals in the second, and 19 minutes of 20 had passed in the third, when... In on goal, checked by Chelios, in front Ozolinsh, scores! Ozolinsh played the hero that night, and they took the 3 games in a sweep. The Sharks were 9-3-1 in their last 13. The back half of February left a lot to be desired, though. After blowing a lead and losing against Philly, getting crushed by the Nordiques and Mike Ricci's 5 goals, they got one back against the Kings. It was an important game that would create a bit of a buffer, for now, between them in the 8th seed and their Pacific rivals looking for an in. But then the Sharks just resurrected their woeful ways for the next 4 games. A 6-3 loss to Dallas made it look closer than it was, a 3-1 loss to the Habs where Jeff Odgers scored their only goal, a loss to Ottawa, who hadn't won their last 12 games, and their first goal was scored by a guy named Darren Rumble. They got shut out by Detroit despite a valiant effort from Irbe, and could only muster a tie against the second-to-worst Winnipeg Jets. Suddenly, that lead they enjoyed 10 days ago in the playoff picture had halved, and the Ducks and Kings were only 3 points behind. Fortunately, this appeared to light a fire under them, as they took down the lowly Oilers, smoked the Ducks for seemingly the billionth time, almost took down the Sabres were it not for a late third-period goal by McGillney, and held on against the Islanders to effectively undo their 4-game winless streak. But no team, especially a middling one like the Sharks, can afford to be satisfied with just undoing past mistakes. They have to outdo them. And they would learn that lesson the hard way because, you guessed it, they started losing again. They lost what looked statistically like it was the most boring game in all of creation to Calgary, and then lost again to the Senators, who outshot and outplayed them despite not winning their last 21 road games. It's losses like the latter that can absolutely shatter public confidence in a team. Remember, this Sharks team was already miles ahead of their prior season's high watermark, but the Senators were a team that had tied them for a near historical worst NHL season, gunning for the Alexander Daig pick, and were on their way to putting up a similarly hideous showing this season. How do you lose to them twice? The Sharks were supposed to be a team fighting for the last playoff spot in the Western Conference with 2 rivals hot on their tail. There were, give or take, a dozen games left in the regular season. Again, with so much on the line, how do you get your butt handed to you like that? The Sharks knew they didn't have to make it interesting, right? They could just win and get in the playoffs easily without giving the Kings or Ducks any hope. They knew that, right? Apparently not, because they lost to the Kings 2 days later, with Irbe's 42 saves keeping it from looking a lot worse than just 2-1. A small mercy was that Gretzky was sitting at 799 goals, one short of Gordie Howe's all-time record. They kept him from getting either the record tire or the record breaker in their barn. The very next day, they would play the Kings again. But for the first time since trading depth defenseman Rob Zettler to the Flyers for Slava Butsayev, the Sharks had a trade to announce. 2 days before the deadline, they sent bottom pair defensemen Mike Lalore and Doug Smolek to Dallas for a 7th-round pick and Ulf Dahlin. It was a deal that made sense for the Sharks. Outside of that top 5, their offense was nothing at all to write home about, and Dahlin was an offensive top 6 player who had spent 3 and change seasons on Mike Modano's wing. He was in his prime, who was also tough on the puck and a power play specialist. That's a pretty solid skill set for a team like the Sharks to work with, a possession-focused team. Regarding what they gave up, Smolek and Lalore were the 2 members of a revolving bottom 3 defenseman door. The depth chart was essentially Sandis Ozolinsh, Jeff Norton, Tom Peterson, and everybody else. Injuries didn't help either. Having a slew of not-so-high-end defensemen choking up the depth charts worked in their favor, as they could trade from a position of strength to shave off their D-depth to something more concrete. It was one of the more sane trades in what was an absolutely wild 1994 deadline. Dahlin would pay immediate dividends, scoring a goal 17 seconds into the second. But despite putting up 6, the Kings matched that. 2 of the goals coming from Gretzky, the second of which tied Gordie Howe for the all-time record. The Sharks would have no time for shuffling their feet and feeling sorry for themselves because they had another brutal road trip ahead of them. And it could decide their playoff fate. Up first was Pittsburgh, who was a bona fide contender and whom they'd never beaten in Pittsburgh. Then Toronto, who were a bona fide contender and whom they'd never beaten in Toronto. Winnipeg, and St. Louis, who they'd never beaten in 10 tries. Irbe made 37 saves to force the Penguins to a tie. Dave Andreychuk's 50-goal party was ruined by Irbe, again. Larionov had a hat trick and a smacking of the Jets, and a come-from-behind win against the Blues ended the trip in style. Voila! A 4-game unbeaten streak against mostly great teams at a critical point in the season. With 8 games left, the Sharks were a nigh insurmountable 8 points ahead of the Ducks and 10 ahead of the Kings. And they just kept on rolling. It was all momentum. They slaughtered the Jets again, a game in which Mike Rathje scored his first career goal on the power play after Keith Tkachuk got upset that the Sharks were playing to win, which is odd because his team was definitely playing to lose. You'd think that would be a harmonious dynamic, but no. This society shuns traditional winner roles. A 3-goal third period against the Maple Leafs featured tallies from everyone you're happy to see score. Pat Falloon, Jamie Baker, Todd Ellick, Ulf Dahlin, and 4-year-old Ray Whitney. Another offensive explosion, the 5th straight game with 4 or more goals, brought the Sharks to the doorstep of what once seemed impossible. A showdown with the Kings that could clinch them their first ever playoff berth. But for now, they could celebrate this win against the Canucks, because with this win, they had earned 77 standings points, and it solidified a miracle. When all was said and done, the 1993 and 94 Sharks earned a 58-point swing, unheard of in this league. It was, and remains, the greatest single-season turnaround in NHL history. But they weren't out of the woods yet. If the Kings win, they stay alive. If the Sharks win, they've made the dance with 4 games to spare and knocked the Kings out. And surprisingly, without incredible fanfare, they did it. Jamie Baker scored both clutch goals on an emergent line with Pat Falloon and Ray Whitney to knock out the Kings and give the Sharks their first ever spot at the rodeo. Their franchise record 7th straight win punched their ticket. It's fitting that the goals would come from Jamie Baker, no less. In the back half of the season, after most every game the Sharks would win, he would quote the newly released Dumb and Dumber, with the appropriate and immortal,
"So you're telling me there's a chance?"
And it stuck. And there was a chance. And the Sharks made the goddamn most of it. After a perfect storm of circumstances that made the Nucks the rightful winner of the next game, the Sharks ended the season taking their eye off the ball a little bit. If shot totals are anything to go by, they definitely took their foot off the gas some and let a game or two get away from them. But hey, they had absolutely earned their spot. It was ugly, it was inconsistent, and it was teal. Most of all, earned by the guy between the pipes. Arturs Irbe played a gargantuan 74 games this season, amassing a then record of 4,411 minutes and 38 seconds of playing time. That record has since been broken by Martin Brodeur a half dozen times and other former Sharks goalies, but whatever. The point is, nobody was relied on more than Arturs Irbe. He was not their best player. He didn't have an elite year, but he was easily the most valuable member of the team. They don't get a video 30 years later if it's not for him. And it was more common for him to steal games for the Sharks than it was for the offense to do so. After all, the Sharks were 20th of 26 in goals for and 14th in goals against. The disparity's pretty clear. But that's not to take away from the offense. While on the whole it was subpar, there were some very noticeable bright spots. Waiver claim Todd Ellick led the team in points per game and was runner-up in points proper. Makarov and Larionov were electric on the top line, even in their mid-30s. 21-year-old Sandis Ozolinsh was second in the league in goals for defensemen behind Al McInnes. He had more points than Yager that year. The youth contingent was successful for the Sharks as well. Ozolinsh, Falloon, and Ray Whitney all finished top 20 in point scoring for players 21 and under. Since acquiring Dahlin, which effectively solidified their lines, they went 8-2-3, and the line of Baker, Falloon, and Whitney shined. All that was left now is to look forward to the season that really matters against the first seed. But in that first seed, the Sharks would be facing a foe that they had met before, but now in a context that was do or die, a scenario which the other team's roster of Hall of Famers and elite players and clutch players would undoubtedly thrive in. And the Sharks would look at them in awe. The first in the conference, Red Wings, who had history with the Sharks just this year, ended their season with a ridiculous 9-0 win against the Patrick Roy Canadiens. I sure hope they don't pay the price for doing that a second time. With their ascendancy and with the fall of teams like the Oilers and the Kings, the run-and-gun style of the 80s was taking its very last breaths. Very few teams could manage that kind of offense as the 90s came into full swing. The Red Wings did it with no issues every single year. The Wings were so good in the 90s that basically whenever they lost, which wasn't often, it was considered an upset regardless of who they played. Not least of all because their offense was more potent than barrel-aged nitroglycerin. Due to some goofy scheduling, Game 1 was moved from the weekend to Monday, and instead of going 2-2-1-1-1 for venue changes, Games 1, 2, 6, and 7 would be in Detroit, while 3 through 5 would all be in San Jose, like baseball. But before the series began, There was a very, very interesting piece of subterfuge from the Sharks that inadvertently helped them in this series. And it all starts with Tom Peterson's girlfriend.
2 weeks before the playoffs were going to start, we played Detroit. And so they were in San Jose to play us, and they stayed at whatever hotel the visiting team stayed at. After the game was over and they left, Tommy Peterson, he came in my office and he handed me a packet of about 20 pieces of paper. You might find this interesting. And I said, what is it? He goes, well, look through it. And I started looking through it. And it's Detroit's game plan for us in the playoffs, because it was kind of getting to where it was obvious we were going to play them. And so I said to him, like, how did you get this? And he said, well, my girlfriend works the front desk at the hotel where they were staying. Assistant coaches came down to her and said, can you make me a copy of this? And she went in the back room to the copy machine and looked at it. And being a hockey player's girlfriend and being a smart gal, she made 2 copies.
It was the Red Wings series to lose. Most people chalk the series up to a learning experience for the Sharks. Ouch. But there were some who knew that the Sharks were exactly the kind of team that could give the Red Wings fits. Maybe, just maybe, nah, the Wings were too good. But too good? Maybe that's an opening. Steve Yzerman would be out for Game 1 of this series, which weirdly enough is not the first time it's happened in a video on this channel. Irbe would make a clutch early stop on Paul Coffey going end-to-end not once, but twice. And Sean Cronin flipped the Sharks' first playoff goal off a skate and passed Essenza seconds later. Despite the Wings still threatening and outskating the Sharks, Johan Garpenlov fed Larionov through 6 Michigan legs to double their lead. Only a few minutes later, Makarov would make it 3-0 on the power play. Over the second and into the third, the Red Wings pour it on and eventually erased that lead. And a few back and forth minutes later, Baker would restore it.
Baker shot, scores! Jamie Baker, roof of the net.
But the Wings got it right back on the power play on a somewhat controversial was it a kick call. Tough for Irbe, who did a good job covering it, but that's a goal. The Sharks and Wings had a few chances to retake the lead, and eventually, one of them actualized just that.
Dolan, Ellick back there as well, and they get the puck. Here's Ellick, back through, shot. They score! It's Krupa with the shot, and the Sharks lead 5-4.
Vlasdy Krupa, the 18-year-old who was just drafted over the summer, gave the Sharks a lead that they wouldn't relinquish. Dino Ciccarelli would admit after the game that he thought the Sharks were the best team in the league over the last 10 games, so he and his team would do poorly to underestimate them, and they definitely did no such thing in Game 2. The Wings were all over the Sharks, with Irbe standing tall time and time again, but he could only do so much.
Sean Burr onside, breaking it on goal, Burr shoots, Irbe the save! Here's another chance, Burr scores!
This was basically the story of the whole game. Hey, there's Ciccarelli getting on the board. There were a few instances of injuries on the play that would result in one of the most hilarious news headlines I've ever seen, but of course nothing came of it. Red Wings fans will note that this was Chris Osgood's first ever playoff appearance, and he was the first rookie wing to get such a shutout since Terry Sawchuk. Back to San Jose Arena for the Sharks' first ever home playoff game, the teams traded end-to-end chances in the first, but the Wings' firepower prevailed early, setting them up with a 2-0 lead that didn't get any larger because of Irbe's absolute heroism between the pipes. The dude was flailing around in net trying to keep up with the Wings who had jockstrapped all his D-men, but he made all of the saves he could, culminated in this epic reach-across, bare-handed save on Ray Shepherd.
Irbe's got no glove on his right hand. His blocking glove was gone. And I'm wondering if he made that save with his bare hand.
Finally, after 40 minutes of play, the Sharks brought the fans to their feet.
Well covered by Howe.
The
Wrapper on top. Good goal.
O'Donnell has been trying to do that wrap for 2 periods.
Nice to see that Mickey Redmond has been talking over the play for 30 years. Cronin almost blew the roof off the building a minute later.
Clear now, the Sharks do. Out the corner.
But Sean Burr sunk a 2-on-1 in short order to put the game out of reach. Funny moment here, Vlad Konstantinov, of all people, had a breakaway in the third and absolutely ate it. Makarov would bury the puck and Paul Coffey in garbage time, but the Sharks would still be down 2-1, having been significantly outplayed in every game. Now with the 2-game win streak under their belt, the Red Wings had their confidence back again, and the Sharks were still floundering. It was undoubtedly hard for them coming into the series knowing the pedigree of the Wings and having to deal with those expectations. And just when they thought they had a hope spot after Game 1, now they're right back where they started, behind the 8 ball and unable to score on Chris Osgood. But there were at least 2 more games guaranteed, and they had come too far to just lose. The Sharks again were down 2-0 after the first period, and it looked like the Sharks would have a tough time cracking Osgood again. Down a man, nobody thought that the Sharks could use it to their advantage. Tom Peterson, with a nasty curl and drag on Paul Coffey, sniped it past Osgood, but a big boo-boo by Irbe sent the Sharks down 2 again. Soon after, Jason Moore saved a goal by just squatting in net, as you do, when that first line worked their magic to bring the Detroit lead to 3-2. Then, the newest member of the Sharks made it even.
Rebound to the side, they go!
From there on out, the game was everything you'd expect from the '94 Sharks.
On a 2-on-1 with Slava Kozlov. Fedorov in on goal to Kozlov. Saved by Irbe!
Gotta be aggressive and gotta take care of the bank.
A break for Larionov with Makarov, 2-on-1. Here's Igor Larionov. Makarov, they score!
Who else? Who else but those two? From there to the end, Irbe shut the door, and man, watching this game, you could tell that this win felt real special. The series was only even at 2, but something was brewing for the Sharks. Something the Wings had best get out of the way of, lest they be trampled underfoot. Sure enough, riding all that momentum, the Sharks scored on their first 2 shots of the game, chasing Osgood from the net. Detroit, now with Steve Yzerman, would battle back but never close the gap, and the Sharks pulled away thanks to first postseason goals from Johan Garpenlov and Bob Airey. Somehow, someway, despite being outshot again 35-1, the Sharks were 1 win away from completing one of the most improbable upsets in NHL history. From Irbe out, timely saves and timely goals are always going to be enough to sink a more skillful team. But when Game 6 rolled around, welcome to the real world, boys.
Chase on, will drive a shot, score!
Holy mackerel.
Primo in front for Shepard, he's alone, he scores!
There you go.
It is 3-0. Fedorov trying to dump it in front, here's Cicerelli wheeling, Kozlov scores!
Bingo.
Lidstrom moving in, backhand pass, Yzerman scores! It's not a power play goal with Cicerelli, he's behind the defense. Cicerelli, the shot, he scores!
It was bound to happen at some point. The Red Wings offense just wasn't going to be denied. Irbe had ensured that they'd been on and off throughout the series, but still, they had scored about 4 goals per game, and now they had the momentum in a Game 7 at their home barn. If the Sharks season ends here, then it's still a success. The greatest turnaround in history, compounded with taking a generational team all the way to Game 7 and proving that San Jose hockey was to be taken seriously. All parts of a successful season. If it ends here. Less than a minute in, that top 5 again struck pay dirt.
Meanwhile, here comes Makarov of San Jose. Gives it back. The passing in front. They score! They score! San Jose is on the board.
That's a gorgeous passing play from Larionov to Ozolinsh to Garpenlov, who buried it, and it sucked the wind out of the Joe early. When the Red Wings had the same critical looks, they blew them. Over halfway through the period, Igor Larionov snapped a breakout pass from his own zone to Sergei Makarov, who apparently didn't know he was in his mid-30s, as he blew by everybody. That's a terrible goal to give up, and Darren Pang on the broadcast said that was a goal that could destroy a team's morale. It surely ballooned the Sharks' confidence, though not as much as Irbe's heroics at the other end.
Irbe to save! Arturs Irbe!
The Red Wings' tempers got the better of them, and it all seemed to be falling apart. Until the final seconds of the period, where Ozolinsh and Irbe made a boo-boo.
Keeping our focus. Look, puck in front. They score!
With Fedorov in the box, there was some miscommunication behind the net between Irbe and his defender, and somehow the puck popped right to Chris Draper. And early in the second, the Wings just overpowered the Sharks.
Quick rebound, but Cicerelli goes wide. Here's Kozlov. Kozlov in the slot. He won't shoot. Kozlov behind the net. The
What an electric goal. With all that Motown momentum, Irbe stood tall, keeping it even into the third period. Ozolinsh made a clutch defensive play on Cicarelli and Kozlov early in the third, and Irbe, well, you get the idea. Irbe was hot. The entire time, at the other end of the ice, Chris Osgood was attracting cobwebs. Irbe was hot. Osgood, a good goalie, was the worst thing a goalie could be. Cold. For car engines and goalies, few things are more dicey than cold starts. One of the few times the puck came into the wing zone, Osgood, antsy for some action, came out to play it, and he somehow didn't get burned. What a save. A few minutes later, he tried his luck again.
Osgood backhands, but not out. The shot from the front. They score! Number 13 is not unlucky for the San Jose Sharks. Jamie Baker, who scored the first goal of the series, scores the biggest goal in the Sharks' history.
Jamie Baker read Osgood like a book, pinching up along the near side boards, and with just a little bit of luck, it came right to him. That same luck did not grace Nicholas Lidstrom, who was the only poor sap back covering for Osgood. The Sharks had 6:35 to hold the lead, but their not-so-secret weapon had played over 4,000 minutes in the regular season. 6 minutes is peanuts. The Sharks looked a little worried. Irbe did not.
Cicarelli looking. Pinholes in front. Loose puck. Irbe finding it and covering it up with 31.8 seconds to go. He couldn't jam it in the net. And the Sharks clear the zone. 20 seconds to go. San Jose, California. Do you believe it? Your Sharks are in the second round. Stunned. The crowd happy. The Sharks happy. That's an understatement.
Words cannot do this upset justice. If I have done my storytelling right, they won't have to. Just over 12 months ago, the San Jose Sharks lost their 71st game of the season, one of the worst in professional sports history. And now, here they are with only a handful of offensive dynamos, but a lot of heart and a lot of dedication, and mother-loving Arturs Irbe. They still needed to win 3 more rounds to get to the Stanley Cup, but make no mistake, this is as successful of a season as you can have, as anyone could ever have without winning it all. But they hadn't won it all, yet. No rest for the weary, because another titanic opponent stood in their way. The Toronto Maple Leafs of 1994 were similarly defense-minded, but there were a few standout all-stars that really vaulted them into contender conversations. Doug Gilmour, Dave Andreychuk, Wendell Clark, Mike Gartner, and 22-year-old Felix Potvin. 3 of those 4 are in the Hall of Fame, and that's not even counting 33-year-old Glenn Anderson. While the Leafs' defensive game was stout, they were a top-heavy team, very much so. Clark, Gilmour, and Andreychuk accounted for almost half of Toronto's goals that season. 126 of 280. That's 45%. Nobody else even got 45 points. The Sharks, when that line had been stifled, had always found ways to win, keeping the games low event enough to get Irbe to steal them. And given how he'd played against Detroit, everyone knew he could. But at some point, the Sharks needed their offense to play well enough to win, which you can't really say happened for most of the Red Wings series. So let's just see here. As if proof were needed that people don't give this series the respect it deserves, like the Sharks season just ended after the Wings' defeat, I couldn't find footage of Game 1 anywhere. But apparently it was an even, if typically low event, game. Clark scored earlier in the first, no surprise there, but Larionov answered back a few minutes later. Taranov would respond in the second, but in its final minutes, Pat Falloon tied it right back up again. And with 2.25 minutes remaining in the game, Johan Garpenlov beat Felix Potvin to give the Sharks the lead and the win. Another thrilling W on the way to Lord Stanley. Game 2, well, the Sharks got trucked. The Maple Leafs completely clowned them for 5 straight goals, only allowing Jeton Duchesne to score late in the third out of sheer pity for the young man. They outshot the Sharks 38-20. Just like with the Wings, it seems like the obviously better team gets a convincing win reminding us of their power, but only after they drop one. Despite blowing out the Sharks, that's not a recipe for the Leafs' success. The Sharks are stealing W's, and the Red Wings caught on to that too late. Game 3 was back in San Jose, and boy was that crowd ready to see the miraculous season continue. And who else would open the scoring early but the captain?
Constantine doesn't like to use the word shadow on Gilmore.
Borshevsky would tie it up again on a play that definitely would not survive past the 0-5 lockout, and a really unfair 5 in a game on Vlasti Krupa would send the Sharks down for a full major.
Borshevsky down to Gilmore. Gilmore, Miranda, Irbe is down, and Cody just sweeps it away!
But they killed it off, and rattled off 3 straight goals in the second to put the game out of reach.
San Jose, puck gets launched at his skates, but he keeps it in the zone. The shot, score! Peterson went in for the Sharks. Peterson's got Irbe. He centers the shot. Hooks putt in from Riva. Putt down to the save on Duchesne. Almost 3-1. Here's O'Dellman. The wraparound. He scores! Corner. He's out there with Ellick and Whitney and Goodrow. Dahlen behind the net in front. They score!
With the Maple Leafs pushing, Ulf Dahlen sunk a hat-trick goal.
On a 2-on-1, Dahlen scores!
There was also a lot of flaring tempers as the Maple Leafs again failed to take a series lead and ended up trailing. The big bad Ulf catapulted the Sharks to another shocking 2-1 lead, 2 wins from the conference final. But Game 4 was right back to the ugly. The, wait, hold on, we'll destroy them so everyone knows we're still the better team despite it still only counting as 1 game, that kind of ugly. And for the love of Pete, can sports writers go a single game without making a water pun when talking about the Sharks? Irbe got chased after allowing 6 goals on 25 shots. Brutal. But he can't save the Sharks' bacon every game. And in Game 5, he wouldn't have to. Because in what could possibly be the last game, again, in front of San Jose fans, that old Soviet Sergei Makarov put the entire team on his back.
In the West, I'm like, here's a breakaway from Makarov. He's in. He scores! Still a minute and 3 to go on the Toronto penalty. Larionov in front. They score! Makarov circles back at the point. No power play here, but the Sharks are setting up. In the Toronto zone, Larionov, he'll take the shot. Save, rebound, and score! Base strong point by his own admission. Here's Larionov. The pass, the shot, they score!
Makarov had 3 points in the first, and Larionov had 3 assists across the balance of the game to close the door on the Maple Leafs 5-2. 1 win from the conference finals. The Maple Leafs came through strong, though they were under the gun. Wendell Clark, in particular, felt it was his turn to put the team on his back.
Already in the game. Here's a chance for
The rest of the first was bogged down by penalties, but the scoreboard was finally dented again halfway through regulation.
But the Sharks intercept. Ozolic. Here's Larionov coming in. Scores!
But that would be it for the second period as well. 1-1. Final regulation period. Leafs lose, and they're out. An interference penalty against Sandis Ozolic that, was sold a little, ended up costing his team. But it's all good. The least mentioned member of the Sharks' Big Five got his first goal of the playoffs 2 minutes later. The two team carriers negated each other in a great defensive backcheck from Makarov, and no more goals would come in regulation. the San Jose Sharks would have their first franchise playoff overtime. And they almost had it.
They slap it ahead. Makarov steals it. Here's Garpenlov. Shot. Going. No, he hit the crossbar. It hit the crossbar.
Johan Garpenlov hit the crossbar from 50 feet out. An unlucky bounce for them, and a fortunate bounce for the Maple Leafs would be all they needed to clinch a 7th game.
Gilmore, center. Scores. Gardner scores. And Toronto sends the series for a 7th game. McCart going for the net. Gilmore right in. Shoots. And then stopped. He's up there with Garpenlov coming for the net. Dropped it back to Ozelins. He centered it. Great play. And 4:15 remaining in the second period. Here's Gilmore. Set up. Goal. Gardner set up by Gilmore. And the referee has waved the arms. To center is Osborne with Berg. Osborne driving the shot. He scores! And does to center. He shoots it ahead to Clark with Gilmore and Gardner in front. Gilmore scores! Not Gilmore! Took the pass! And the Leafs will advance against the Vancouver Canucks in the Western Conference Final. It ends up with a Leaf net. It's going to be 4-2.
No, you know what? No sad music. Get that out of here. Yes, they got eliminated, and that's always sad, but this is as successful of a season as anyone could have short of a championship. An all-time upset, nearly a second all-time upset, the greatest single-season turnaround in NHL history. A brand new team with brand new players made the third time the charm and reversed the fortunes of the San Jose Sharks forever. In the next quarter century, the Sharks would make the playoffs 21 times. Only in just the last few years have they started returning to being a non-playoff team. Unfortunately, they would achieve their success without any of the 93-94 Sharks. Within 3 seasons, all of these players but Ray Whitney would be gone, and many would have even more successful careers elsewhere. Ozelins with the Avalanche and the Ducks, Larionov with the Red Wings, Irbe with the Hurricanes, even Ray Whitney would have a 1,000-game career when all was said and done. Kevin Constantine would be fired after 1996. He would describe it as traumatic and upsetting, taking it very personally and thinking that there was something wrong with him as a coach. But also, many years later, would understand that while there are things for him to work on, often a firing has many factors that are completely outside of his control. Often, an organization decides what changes need to be made, and a coaching change is what they went with. Now, having coached internationally for 30-odd years, he understands much more the nature of the business, something he didn't realize he wasn't prepared for in 1994. But in fairness, how could any of the 1994 Sharks be prepared for what would happen? At the time, they were regarded as either too young, too old, or too forgettable amongst their player core to have any kind of mark on NHL history, much less an indelible one. Nobody knows the future, and about faces like this aren't things that come around often. But when they do, nobody ever forgets them. A very special thank you to all of my patrons, especially Amazing Kook 143, Eric Sheldon, Ethan Johnson, Infernos Gaming, Paultham, Pylon Zin, Sky Shiver, Steely Dan 32, and Stuckmund.